Okay, welcome back. So, in the previous video or videos, if you watch both of them, we factor quadratic trinomials, okay? We factor quadratic trinomials. Now we have to see how we can use factoring quadratic trinomials to actually solve a quadratic equation, okay? Now, make sure that your factoring skills are nice and strong. I'm not going to show all the steps leading to how I factor it. I'm just going to go straight to what the factors are in this video. It will be assumed that you guys are pretty good at factoring by now, okay? So if not, go back, check out those videos. I'll put the links right up here. Make sure you check those out. Make sure that we're solid with factoring, okay? Now, factoring quadratic trinomials. So for example, like let's say we had a quadratic trinomial. Let's say we had something like, let's say x squared plus 2x minus 24 is equal to 0, okay? Now, just like when we were factoring quadratic expressions, we wanted to make sure that everything was in standard form. Okay, remember the standard form of a quadratic expression was ax squared plus bx plus c. Well, the standard form of a quadratic equation is just that, but it's equal to 0, okay? That is the standard form of a quadratic equation, okay? So it's the exact same thing, except it's equal to 0. And that equal to 0 might not seem like a big deal, but it's actually a huge deal. We're going to use that in a very special way, okay? So whenever we're solving a quadratic equation by factoring, or even in future videos when we talk about like the quadratic formula and stuff like that, more on that later. But anytime we're pretty much solving a quadratic equation, we want it in standard form. So there's a couple steps that we want to follow. The first step is to make sure it's in standard form, so we want to move everything. To one side of the equation. That's what we want to do. We want to move everything on the one side of the equation, as we see right here. Everything is on one side and 0 is on the other side, okay? That's the first thing that we always want to make sure that we do. And if you look over here, it's already in that form, okay? All of our terms are on the left-hand side and we just have 0 on the other side, okay? So from there, what we want to do, well, we're solving these by factoring, so we want to factor, all right? Simple enough. All right, so if we were to go ahead and factor this, this would factor to x plus 6 and x minus 4. Go ahead and feel free to pause the video and try that on your own, but this would go ahead and factor to x plus 6 and x minus 4, okay? So once we have everything on one side of the equation, we factor. Once we factor, there's really only one step left. And what that step is we want to use what's called the zero product property. We want to use what's called the zero product property, and that sounds like it might be confusing, but it's really not, okay? All the zero product property states is, like, let's say for example you had two numbers, let's call them A and B, and when you multiplied A and B they got you 0, okay? Well, think about the only way there is to multiply to 0. One of those numbers has to be 0, so either A equals 0 or B equals 0, or in pretty much all these cases, both of them are going to be 0, okay? And you'll see why once we start talking about the graphs. So when we have two numbers multiplying each other and the product is 0, that means one or both of the numbers have to be 0. We'll take a look at what we have here. We have x plus 6 times x minus 4, and when we multiply these two together, they get us 0. So what that means is either x plus 6 gets us 0, or x minus 4 gets us 0, or both of them get us 0. And that's actually what the case is. So this is actually what the zero product property states, okay? What we do to use a zero product property, and this is very important, so I would write this down, is we set each factor with a variable in it equal to 0, and then we solve for that variable. So we had x plus 6, that was a factor, it had a variable in it. I set it equal to 0. I had x minus 4, that was a factor with a variable in it. I set it equal to 0, and now I solve each of these equations. Okay, so when I solve for x in this equation, I would subtract each side by 6. So I would get x equals negative 6. And in this equation, to solve for x, I would add 4 to each side. That would get us 4. Which means we have two answers of negative 6 and positive 4. Okay, So that's what solving by factoring is. We want to get everything on one side first, then we want to factor, then we set each factor equal to 0 that has a variable in it and solve. Okay? So let's take a look at another example. Let me get another example up here. All right, let's say I had something like, and I'll write example. Let's say I had something like 10x squared plus 9x is equal to negative 2. Okay, so when we're solving this, remember, your first step is to make sure you're in standard form, which means everything needs to be on one side of the equation, 0 needs to be on the other side. This is not the case so far. I want everything on one side of the equal sign. So what I can do is I can bring that 2 over by adding 2 to each side. So I'm moving the 2 over, so I'm going to have 10x squared plus 10x plus 2 is equal to 0. Okay, so step 1 done. Everything's on one side. Now we want to factor. We need to factor now, okay? So go ahead and pause the video and try factoring this. I'm going to go ahead and show you what the factors are. So if you went ahead and factored this, what this would factor to is 5x plus 2 and 2x plus 1, okay? So we get 5x plus 2 and 2x plus 1, okay? That's what we should have gotten for these factors. And now what we do is we use the zero product property. We set each factor with a variable in it equal to 0, and we solve, okay? So in this case, we would go ahead and we would solve each of these equations. So I would subtract 2 from each side in this equation. So I'm going to have 5x is equal to negative 2, and then I would divide by 5 to get x is equal to negative 2/5, okay? But that's actually only one of my two answers. That's actually only one of my two answers. I have to figure out what the other one is. So in this equation, I would subtract 1 from each side to get 2x is equal to negative 1, and then I would divide each side by 2 to get x is equal to negative 1/2. So these would be my two answers. Alright, so why not? I'll go ahead and I'll show you guys another problem. And I want you guys to go ahead and actually try this one. Pause the video and try this one out. This one's going to be a little bit trickier. Okay, there's going to be a little bit more of a process with this one. But go ahead and try this one out. Remember, first step, always get everything on one side. Then we want to factor. Then we set those factors equal to 0 and solve. So let's say we had 7x squared minus 2x minus 12 is equal to x squared minus 3x. Go ahead and pause the video and try this one out. Alright, so hopefully you tried this one. Alright, so what we have here is we have stuff on both sides of the equation. What we need, remember, is to get everything on one side of the equation. So I'm going to bring everything over to the left side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract x squared from each side, and I'm going to add 3x to each side. And when I do that, I'm going to have 6x squared plus 1x minus 12 is equal to 0. That's what we want. We want everything on one side of the equation, 0 on the other side, okay? And now from here, we should go ahead and we should factor this, okay? And I'm actually going to go ahead and show this one by hand because this is one that requires maybe just a little bit more work. So we're multiplying to a times c. Well, 6 times negative 12 is negative 72. And we want to add to b, which is 1, okay? Now, what those numbers are, well, that would actually be 9 and negative 8. Negative 8 times 9 is negative 72. Negative 8 plus 9 is 1. Okay? And then we would go ahead and we would factor. So remember, you bring down your first term, you bring down your last term, and you split the middle. Okay? So now I would go ahead and factor this by grouping. So I would be able to take out, let's see, we can take a 2x out here, which will leave us with 2x is times a quantity of 3x minus 4. And then I could take out a positive 3 here, which will leave us with 3x minus 4. And as you can see, we have that common binomial. That's what we need. We can factor that out to get 3x minus 4 times a quantity of 2x plus 3. So that is what our two factors would be, okay? And remember, once you factor, now we set each of the factors with a variable in it equal to 0. And now we solve, okay? And what you would get as answers is x is equal to 4/3 and x is equal to -3/2. That would be our two solutions, okay? All right, hopefully this helped out, okay? That was solving quadratic equations. In our next video, we're actually going to take a look at how we can use these to solve quadratic inequality, something that is totally new to a lot of us, okay? So make sure we check that out. If we need more practice, feel free to go ahead and let me know. But go ahead and make sure that we're checking out this next video for quadratic inequalities.